was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a cruise ship vacation to celebrate our anniversary. The ship was massive, with endless decks, pools, and restaurants. My wife, Emily, and I were thrilled. The first few days were magical, filled with sun, sea, and extravagant dinners. But on the third night, everything changed. It started with a whisper in the dark. We were in our cabin, a luxurious suite with a balcony overlooking the ocean. The gentle rocking of the ship usually lulled us to sleep, but that night I woke to a faint sound. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was a voice, a soft, eerie whisper. "Come to me." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. Emily stirred beside me, but remained asleep. I strained my ears, but the whispering had stopped. Telling myself it was just a dream, I lay back down and eventually drifted off. The next morning, the atmosphere on the ship felt different. The crew seemed tense, and the other passengers were unusually quiet. I mentioned the whisper to Emily, but she laughed it off, attributing it to the ship's old structure making strange noises. We spent the day exploring the ship, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. That evening, we attended a show in the Grand Theater. The performance was spectacular, but halfway through, the power suddenly went out. The entire ship plunged into darkness, and an uneasy murmur rippled through the audience. The emergency lights flickered on a few moments later, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, assuring us it was just a minor technical issue. But I couldn't ignore the cold knot of fear tightening in my stomach. Back in our cabin, the whispering returned. This time, Emily heard it too. Her face went pale, and she clutched my arm as the chilling voice filled the room. "Find me." We called the front desk, but they dismissed it as a prank or perhaps some electronic interference. Frustrated and scared, we decided to investigate ourselves. We roamed the ship, our footsteps echoing in the deserted corridors. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the silence of the night. As we passed the old, disused part of the ship, we heard it again, clearer this time. "Find me," in the dark. The voice seemed to be coming from the abandoned lower decks. Against our better judgment, we descended the narrow staircase into the bowels of the ship. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread enveloped us. The lower deck was a maze of rusted metal and forgotten rooms, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Help me." We followed the voice to a small, locked door. It looked ancient, with peeling paint and a tarnished brass handle. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Emily found a loose piece of metal, and with some effort, we managed to pry the door open. Inside, the room was pitch black. The air was thick with dust, and a musty smell filled our nostrils. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated a small, cramped space filled with old furniture and debris. In the corner, a large trunk stood out, covered in cobwebs. With trembling hands, I approached the trunk and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, to my horror, were old, tattered clothes and a photograph. The picture was of a young woman, her eyes hauntingly sad. Written on the back was a name, Annabelle. As I showed the photograph to Emily, the whispering grew deafening. "Help me find peace." A sudden, bone-chilling cold swept through the room, and the door slammed shut behind us. Panic set in as we tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Emily's breaths came in short gasps, and I felt a sense of impending doom. Then, as abruptly as it began, the whispering stopped. The temperature returned to normal, and the door creaked open. We stumbled out, our minds reeling. We decided to take the photograph to the captain, hoping he could shed some light on the mystery. The captain listened to our story with a grave expression. He explained that Annabelle was a passenger on the ship many years ago. She had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and her body was never found. Rumors of her ghost haunting the ship had persisted, but the crew had always dismissed them as superstition. Determined to help Annabelle find peace, we returned to the lower deck with the captain and a few crew members. We searched the room thoroughly and discovered a hidden compartment beneath the trunk. Inside was a small, ornate box. We opened it to find a delicate locket with a picture of Annabelle inside. Suddenly, the room grew cold again, and the whispering returned. "Thank you." The ghostly presence seemed to fill the space, and for a moment we could see the faint outline of a woman standing before us. Her eyes were filled with gratitude, and then she vanished, leaving us in stunned silence. The atmosphere on the ship lightened after that night. The crew and passengers seemed more at ease, and the whispering never returned. Emily and I spent the rest of our cruise enjoying the sun and sea, but the memory of that night lingered. We had helped a lost soul find peace, but the experience left a mark on us both. The ocean, vast and mysterious, holds many secrets, and sometimes those secrets whisper in the dark, seeking someone to listen. The anticipation of our cruise vacation had been building for months. My friends, Mark and Lisa, and I had planned this trip as a much-needed escape from our demanding jobs. We boarded the ship with high spirits, ready for a week of relaxation and fun. The first few days were perfect. We lounged by the pool, indulged in decadent meals, and explored the vast expanse of the ship. On the fourth night, after a particularly festive dinner, we decided to check out the ship's nightclub. The music was loud, the lights were dazzling, and the dance floor was packed. As the night wore on, I felt the need for some fresh air and a break from the noise. I told Mark and Lisa I was stepping out for a bit and made my way to the upper deck. The contrast between the pulsating nightclub and the silent, starry night outside was stark. I leaned against the railing, enjoying the cool breeze and the gentle sway of the ship. The ocean stretched out endlessly, dark and mysterious. As I gazed into the black water, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. That's when I saw her. A woman in a white dress, standing at the very edge of the railing a few decks below me. Her long hair fluttered in the wind, and she seemed to be staring out at the sea. My heart skipped a beat. Something about her posture, the way she stood so precariously close to the edge, filled me with unease. I hurried down the stairs to the lower deck, but when I reached the spot where I'd seen her, she was gone. I looked around, but the deck was empty. Puzzled and a little shaken, I returned to the nightclub to find Mark and Lisa. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Mark joked when he saw my face. I told them about the woman, and Lisa's expression grew serious. Maybe she went back to her cabin. People do weird things when they're drunk. We tried to brush it off and enjoy the rest of the night, but the image of the woman in white haunted me. Back in my cabin, sleep came fitfully. I kept hearing strange sounds, like whispers and soft footsteps in the hallway. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, but the unease lingered. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At breakfast, I overheard a group of passengers talking about a woman who had gone missing. My blood ran cold. Could it be the same woman I'd seen last night? I approached the crew and told them what I had witnessed. They listened politely, but seemed skeptical. They assured me they were conducting a thorough search of the ship and that everything was under control. Days passed, and the woman remained missing. The atmosphere on the ship grew tense. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, and the crew appeared on edge. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to take another walk on the deck. The moon cast an eerie glow on the water, and the ship creaked and groaned as it cut through the waves. As I wandered, I heard a faint sobbing sound. I followed it, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound led me to a lifeboat station, where I saw her again, the woman in the white dress. She was sitting on the edge of the lifeboat, her face buried in her hands, crying softly. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling. She looked up, and her eyes met mine. They were filled with a sorrow so profound it took my breath away. She stood up slowly and stepped towards the railing. "Wait!" I shouted, running towards her. But as I reached out, she disappeared. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, leaving me grasping at empty air. Terrified, I ran back to my cabin and locked the door. I didn't sleep at all that night, haunted by the woman's sorrowful eyes. The next day, I told Mark and Lisa what had happened. They exchanged worried glances. "We need to find out who she is," Lisa said. "Maybe we can help her." We began asking around, discreetly at first. We learned that a woman named Sarah had indeed gone missing on the night I first saw the woman in white. She had been traveling alone, and no one knew much about her. The crew had searched the ship thoroughly, but found no trace of her. Desperate for answers, we decided to visit the ship's archive room, where old passenger records and ship logs were kept. We convinced a reluctant crew member to let us in, and we spent hours poring over the documents. That's when we found it, a news article from several years ago. A young woman named Sarah had disappeared from the very same ship, under eerily similar circumstances. Her body was never found, and her case remained unsolved. The ship had a tragic history of disappearances, all involving women who matched the description of the woman in white. We were horrified. It seemed the ship was cursed, haunted by the ghosts of those who had vanished. That night, as we sat in my cabin, trying to make sense of what we had discovered, the temperature suddenly dropped. The lights flickered, and a cold, eerie presence filled the room. "Help us," a voice whispered, sending chills down our spines. We saw her again, standing at the foot of the bed, her eyes pleading. This time she wasn't alone. Behind her stood the ghostly figures of other women, their faces twisted in anguish. "Help us find peace." We knew then what we had to do. The ship's dark past needed to be acknowledged, the spirits laid to rest. We gathered the passengers and crew and held a memorial service on the deck, honoring the lost souls and promising to remember their stories. As we cast flowers into the sea, the air grew warmer, and a sense of peace settled over the ship. The ghostly apparitions faded, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. We had done what we could to help them move on. The rest of the cruise passed uneventfully, but the experience had changed us. We left the ship with a newfound respect for the mysteries of the ocean and the stories that linger in its depths. The woman in white had found her peace, and so had we. But I knew I would never forget those haunting eyes and the chilling whisper of the lost souls, forever etched in my memory. The cruise ship was a marvel of modern engineering, a floating city with every amenity one could imagine. It was my first time on such a grand vessel, a gift from my parents to celebrate my college graduation. I boarded with a mix of excitement and nervousness, eager for the adventure that lay ahead. Little did I know that excitement would soon turn into a nightmare. The first few days were a blur of activities and sightseeing. I made friends with a few other passengers, Rachel, a bubbly young woman traveling alone, and David and Claire, a couple celebrating their honeymoon. We quickly formed a small group, spending our days exploring the ship and our nights enjoying the various entertainment options. On the fourth night, the ship hosted a masquerade ball. The grand ballroom was filled with masked passengers, the air buzzing with laughter and music. I wore a simple black mask, blending in with the crowd. The atmosphere was electric, but as the night wore on, I began to feel a strange unease. It started with a glimpse of a figure out of the corner of my eye, a tall man in a dark, tattered cloak, his mask an eerie, featureless white. He stood motionless at the edge of the dance floor, watching. I turned to Rachel to point him out, but when I looked back, he was gone. Rachel laughed it off, saying I was just seeing things in the dim light. As the night continued, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I caught glimpses of the cloaked figure, always disappearing before I could get a good look. I decided to step outside for some fresh air, hoping to clear my head. The deck was quiet, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull. I leaned on the railing, taking deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around, but there was no one there. The deck was empty, save for the shadows cast by the moonlight. My pulse quickened, and I hurried back inside, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. The next morning, I found Rachel and the others at breakfast. I told them about the man in the cloak and the whisper on the deck. David and Claire exchanged worried glances, but Rachel just laughed. "Sounds like you had a bit too much to drink last night," she said, patting my shoulder. Despite her reassurances, the uneasy feeling lingered. That evening, the ship's captain announced we would be passing through a particularly beautiful stretch of ocean and encouraged everyone to gather on deck to watch the sunset. Hoping the beauty of the scene would distract me, I joined the crowd on the upper deck. The sunset was indeed stunning, the sky ablaze with vibrant hues of orange and pink. For a moment I forgot my fears and marveled at the sight. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky darkening, I felt a cold hand grip my arm. I gasped and turned, coming face to face with the cloaked figure. His mask was inches from mine, the empty eye socket staring into my soul. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, breaking free from his grasp. The crowd around me seemed oblivious, their attention fixed on the sunset. "Help me," the figure whispered, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. I bolted, pushing through the throng of passengers, not stopping until I reached my cabin. I locked the door and sank to the floor, my heart pounding. The image of the figure's mask haunted me, and sleep was a distant hope. The next day, I avoided my friends, too shaken to explain what had happened. I spent most of the day in my cabin, venturing out only when necessary. That night, I was jolted awake by a loud knocking on my door. "Who is it?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. The knocking continued, insistent and relentless. I approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Summoning my courage, I opened the door slightly, only to find a small, folded note on the floor. I picked it up with trembling hands and read the single word scrawled in dark, jagged letters: "Run." I slammed the door shut, my mind racing. I needed to find Rachel and the others, to warn them. I grabbed my jacket and ventured out, the ship eerily silent. I found Rachel in the casino, her face pale as she stared at the slot machines. "Rachel, we need to go. Now," I said, grabbing her arm. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "I've been seeing him too," she whispered. Together, we found David and Claire in the lounge, their expressions mirroring our own terror. We decided to head to the captain's quarters, hoping he could offer some explanation or protection. As we made our way through the darkened corridors, the ship groaned and creaked around us. Shadows seemed to shift and move, and the temperature dropped, our breath visible in the frigid air. We reached the captain's quarters, but the door was ajar, the room inside dark and empty. A sense of dread washed over us as we stepped inside. The room was in disarray, papers strewn across the floor, the captain's chair overturned. On the desk, we found a journal, the last entry dated the previous night. "Something is wrong. Passengers are disappearing. Strange sightings reported. We must turn back." A sudden noise behind us made us jump. The cloaked figure stood in the doorway, his mask now cracked and broken, revealing hollow, empty eyes. He raised a bony hand, pointing at us. "Leave, before it's too late." We didn't need to be told twice. We fled the captain's quarters, racing through the labyrinthine hallways, desperate to find a way off the ship. As we reached the deck, the ship's horn blared, a deafening sound that shook us to our core. In the chaos, we found a lifeboat and hurriedly lowered it into the water. The sea was rough, the waves crashing against the sides of the ship, but we didn't care. We rowed with all our might, putting as much distance as possible between us and the cursed vessel. As dawn broke, we were exhausted, adrift in the open sea. We were eventually rescued by a passing cargo ship, our ordeal finally over. We recounted our harrowing experience to the crew, but they dismissed it as hysteria brought on by fear. To this day, the memory of that cloaked figure haunts me. I can still hear his whisper in my dreams, still feel the cold grip of his hand. The ship was never found, vanishing into the ocean's depths along with its dark secrets. And though I try to forget, I know that some horrors are impossible to escape.